Logical Fallacies. What are logical fallacies, and why is it important that critical thinkers should know about them? A logical fallacy is an error we can make in reasoning, but it usually crops up when we are discussing or arguing our point of view. Some people might even knowingly use them to try and score cheap points in an argument due to intellectual laziness. They are traps we can fall into, but if we know what to look out for, we can spot them when they occur and stop ourselves from using them. This time, we'll look at the appeal to consequences.
This is when it's concluded that an idea or proposition is true or false because the consequences of it being true or false are desirable or undesirable to the one making the claim.
We are all guilty of using this fallacy from time to time. It's normal to embellish ideas or beliefs we like and to denigrate ideas and beliefs we don't. In this case, it's using the expected or possible outcomes, whether they happen or not, to bolster our point of view. This fallacy comes in two forms, positive and negative.
Skeptics complain about alternative medicine and things like ear candles being sold in my pharmacy. But I can tell you, many people say they really work and come here to buy them. Also, my profits depend on it.
Here we have an example of the positive form. The pharmacist is using the perceived positive outcomes or consequences to his customers and the real financial outcome to his business to justify the products on sale. In the case of something like ear candles, where you stick a tube of wax in your ear canal and light the other end, yes, this really is a thing. Glowing testimonials and good sales have no bearing on the fact that these things are dangerous nonsense.
GMOs are evil and must be stopped now. Who knows what awful things will happen to people eating genetically modified foods? They might end up glowing in the dark or worse.
Here we have an example of the negative form. It is being argued that GMOs are bad because of the negative consequences on humans. However, as no one has been able to read a book in the dark owing to glowing skin, or indeed had any reported negative consequences at all from eating GMOs, the original premise of the argument does not hold up.
You see what happens when we stop accepting creationism and turn to the theory of evolution? Immoral conduct, as society turns to survival of the fittest. Caring and compassion are left behind.
Again, the logical fallacy in its negative form. It might come as a shock to creationists, but caring and compassion, just like every other emotion, comes about in our species via the process of evolution. Scaremongering about feared negative outcomes of accepting evolution does not strengthen the case for creationism one little bit. It's so easy to let ourselves think about the consequences or outcomes of ideas, beliefs, or practices. And, as we've seen, it's also easy to use these perceived outcomes to colour our reasoning or to give us faulty ammunition when arguing our point of view. This time, we'll look at the Texas Sharpshooter fallacy.
Also known as the clustering illusion, this is when you downplay or ignore information that doesn't support your argument or point of view and focus on information that seems to be more in line with what you want to be true. It is also imposing meaning onto randomness.
This must surely be one of the more interesting names for any logical fallacy. It comes about from the idea that someone would shoot at random at the side of a barn or fence, then paint a target on later around the bullet holes that happen to be close together to make it appear as if the shots were on target.
In 1555, the prophet Nostradamus foresaw the coronavirus plague of 2020. He wrote in Century 2, Quatrain 35, "The great plague of the maritime city will not cease until there be avenged the death of the just blood, condemned for the price without crime, of the great lady unwronged by pretense."
Finding meaning in the quatrains of Nostradamus is an old game. Since he wrote 942 of them, most of them vague and open to interpretation, and even mistranslation from the French used in the 16th century, it's really not that hard to find at least one or even more you can make fit events of more recent times or at any time since they were written. Just look for the lines that seem to fit and ignore the ones that don't. Much of this quatrain, the maritime city, the lady unwronged, are ignored. This same quatrain has also been used to claim Nostradamus foresaw the Great Plague of London in 1665. If you'd like to know more, there is an excellent book called The Mask of Nostradamus, written by James Randi.
When tested, the water diviner found 3 bottles of water that were hidden from view, one after the other after the other. Now that's just amazing, and points to water divining being real.
This can and does happen during tests of water divining. But short runs of success are expected when conducting many tests. It also happens in casinos when someone might get lucky on the roulette table 2 or 3 or even 4 times in a row. But overall, we all know the house wins in the end. We need to take all the results into account before we can reach a real conclusion.
It's just so strange that bad things seem to happen to me in threes. First, I lost my job, then my dog got sick, and now the TV won't work.
Good and bad things happen from time to time, and both can be random. Since many people have already heard the saying, bad things come in threes, or even famous people die in threes, and so on, it's all too easy for us to see a pattern after 3 such events. But what if bad things come in 4s or 5s? Looking for things that seem to line up is all very well, but you need to also take into account all the related things or events that don't line up, as they too must be considered in the overall pattern of events before you reach a conclusion. This time, we'll look at the anecdotal evidence fallacy.
This is when you are swayed into taking up a position or belief based on isolated examples of data, poor data, or personal experience rather than reliable evidence.
This logical fallacy is surely one of the most common and can be seen in many different circumstances. It can come about from the intrinsic trust we have in the perceived wisdom of our friends and especially our family. After all, Mother knows best.
I hear the Vaxxed bus is touring the country. They make videos of parents and others telling their stories of vaccine damage. It seems then there must be something to the claims that vaccinations are unsafe.
Here we have a classic case of people being swayed by the anecdotal evidence fallacy. If vaccination was as dangerous as the anti-vaxxers would have us believe, that fact would be reflected in ongoing studies worldwide. But it can be compelling to see people pour their hearts out when they really do think vaccines have damaged their children.
People are so skeptical of acupuncture. I bet they haven't tried it for themselves. I was skeptical too until I tried it, and I can tell you that I know it works because it worked for me.
Skeptics have known for years that this sort of anecdotal evidence is almost impossible to counter. When someone, for whatever reason, is convinced that a treatment has worked for them, they will, and understandably so, stick to their guns no matter what. Alas, in this case, the scientific evidence for the claims of acupuncture are very much lacking.
They say the world is heating up and sea levels are rising. But my family has been running the same oyster farm on the river for generations. And you know what? We haven't noticed any change in the water levels at all.
This example is based on a real interview with an oyster farmer in Australia. Even though he might work on the river, that doesn't mean he, or his family going back years, have kept accurate details of water levels. However, to him, things seem more or less the same. Based on this, he is ready to deny climate change. It is often very convenient to rely on anecdotal evidence, and at some times it can seem intuitive. No matter how sure we are, we should never be afraid to check the basis of our opinions and beliefs to see if they are based on shaky ground. This time, we'll look at the burden of proof fallacy.
This is when, instead of presenting evidence to support your claim, you insist that the person doubting it prove your claim to be false.
This tactic, which can seem reasonable to the one committing the fallacy, is heard again and again in skeptical investigations. It's a sort of get out of jail free card and gives the person making the claim a quick way to appear to stump the skeptics, particularly by asking the skeptic to disprove something instead of providing evidence to support the claim being made.
I'll never forget the night I was abducted by aliens. I was driving in the countryside when they beamed me up to their spaceship. 2 hours later, I was back in my car. No one, from police to so-called skeptics, have been able to prove it didn't happen.
This situation is very familiar to skeptical investigators. If the person in question had more to the claim than just his story, maybe a fragment of alien technology, he wouldn't need to worry about others not being able to disprove it.
This new drug to fight coronavirus is just amazing. It's all natural and made from a rare moss only found in the Amazon. I've seen it work for myself, and unless the government can prove otherwise, it must be rolled out as soon as possible.
No matter how appealing it is to think a new drug or even a modality of alternative medicine works, it must first go through the rigorous scientific trials and tests to show it does in fact work. That's where the burden of evidence lies. And by the way, any alternative medicine that does pass scientific trials and tests, that is actually shown to work, is no longer called alternative medicine. It's called medicine.
I had an amazing reading with a medium who contacted the spirit of my dead grandmother and told me things only she would know. How can you prove that it wasn't really her coming through?
Ultimately, no one can prove the medium didn't contact the dead grandmother. But then again, no one can prove it wasn't another spirit pretending to be the grandmother, or a tricky alien from another dimension pretending to be the grandmother, and on and on. What we can do, if the reading was recorded, for example, is to walk the person through what was said pointing out the cold and hot reading tricks that may have been used. Remember that the burden of proof always lies with the one making the claim, and asking them for evidence is an entirely reasonable request. While it is possible sometimes to indeed prove something didn't happen, many times it is not. But that alone does not mean the claim is real. As Dr. Carl Sagan famously said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This time, we'll look at poisoning the well.
Also known as smear tactics, this is when you try to discredit your opponent or an institution, especially in the minds of others, before even entering into a debate or conversation.
This can take many forms and can be used in many situations. Casting doubt on people or ideas you don't agree with is hard to avoid, but you shouldn't use it in place of a sound argument based on the points they raise.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for hearing my opening arguments. Now it's time for my opponent to try and give their side. If nothing else, let's hope they're at least entertaining.
Not very polite or sporting. Here we have a case of someone trying to belittle their opponent and by extension the arguments they might use before even hearing what they have to say.
What? You're thinking of applying for the Skeptic's cash prize? Look, I know your psychic powers are real, but I wouldn't bother applying if I was you. Those skeptics are known to cheat, as no one has ever claimed the prize.
The myth of the skeptics cheating when testing people for the cash prize is widespread. It often comes about from disgruntled applicants who, until now, have always failed. Some honestly believe they were somehow cheated out of the money and will warn others who might want to apply. In reality, skeptical groups go to great lengths to make sure the tests are fair and honest for all concerned. So to argue that skeptics are going to cheat you or set you up to fail if you are a psychic just poisons any possibility of constructive dialogue about testing extraordinary claims.
At the start of the pandemic, those government so-called medical experts told us that we didn't need to wear masks. Now they're saying that we do? They clearly don't know what they're talking about with their chopping and changing. You're not going to get real information from them. So if I were you, I wouldn't even bother listening to their advice about getting vaccinated against COVID-19 in the future.
Here we have a case of casting doubt on a future vaccine based on actions taken early on in the pandemic. In this scenario, the medical authorities, who are the proponents of a future vaccine, are being preemptively attacked. The science and our understanding of COVID-19 is unfolding before our eyes, and medical advice is given on the basis of the latest known information at any given time. This is how science works. It is not a linear, neat process. Poisoning the well is something that can happen before we even know it. If you have a low opinion of your opponent or their point of view, or maybe even you are ignorant of the issue, it's all too easy for your emotions to get the better of you. As ever, try to stick to the argument at hand. This time, we'll look at weasel words.
These are words or phrases that seem to point in one direction or give a certain impression, but in reality are often meaningless or even misleading.
It can be hard, bordering on impossible to get some people to use straightforward, no-nonsense language when putting forward their point of view. We see this so many times in the world of politics, for example, when so-called spin doctors advise politicians on how to not answer questions. But weasel words also pop up in many other situations.
This amazing and all-natural supplement has been used traditionally by thousands of people all over the world for years. It may assist in reducing the length and severity of a cold or the flu.
Here the word traditionally and the word may are the weasel words. It doesn't matter if something has a long tradition, it still might not work as claimed. But using the word traditionally does seem to give the claim merit. We've looked at the logical fallacy of the appeal to tradition before. Also, using the word may gives the impression that the claim is true, or at least could be true. But we could also say may not. If the claim is ever proven to be true, then the words will assist could be used.
You think the Earth is really billions of years old and evolution is real? Not so fast. There is a growing body of evidence that creationism is true as more and more scientists accept the account given in the Bible.
In this example, the terms a growing body and more are the weasel words. They sound grand enough, but where is the raw data from? Has there been a proper survey of the relevant scientists? Are these results published? Without providing this extra information, the veracity of the claim is in doubt.
I know I can get passionate from time to time when expressing my point of view. I would like to say I'm sorry if anyone took offense to what I said.
This is known as the non-apology apology. It gives the impression that someone is acknowledging a wrongdoing and trying to make amends, but in reality, it's putting the focus on others and somehow making them at fault. If a real apology was offered, it would sound something like, I would like to say I'm sorry that I caused offence. From advertising to answers given by politicians to even everyday conversations, weasel words are a way to use language itself as a distraction. If you are unsure about what someone is saying, you have the right to ask them to put it another way, to hopefully get a better answer. This time, we'll look at the hasty generalisation fallacy.
Also known as the argument from small numbers and the lonely fact fallacy, this is when you base your conclusion on limited or inconclusive information.
It's very easy for us to accept limited information or examples when we already believe in the premise, claim, or point of view. But getting to the truth of the matter often means wading through a great deal of examples and results.
Did you see that psychic on live TV the other night? A skeptic held up a sealed envelope with a number from 1 to 10 written inside. The psychic predicted the number would be 4, and she was right. She truly has amazing powers.
In this case, the so-called psychic had a 1 in 10 chance of simply guessing the right number. In order to draw any real conclusions about her alleged powers, this test would need to be repeated many times and under proper scientific conditions. These sorts of tests can take up quite a lot of time, especially on live TV.
In a recent survey, 80% of people questioned said that they did not trust that vaccinations were safe and effective.
80% is a strong result. or is it? The question we must ask is how many people took part in the survey? If only 5 people took part, then it only took 4 of them to give the 80% result. A survey with only 5 people is hardly enough to draw any real conclusions about society in general.
In order to test a water diviner, we set up 10 sealed buckets, some with water inside, some with sand. We planned to run 10 rounds, giving us a score out of 100. But after failing the very first round, the water diviner stormed off in a huff. Once again, we can see that water divining does not work.
This example is based on real events. While it's fair to say that as of yet no water diviner has passed a test of their claimed powers, in this case the result would be null and void as the test was not completed. So it would be incorrect to conclude that this diviner is necessarily lacking in claimed ability based on an incomplete test. Limited results that appear to support our point of view are very easy to accept. Although it can require more time and effort, generally speaking, the more data points you have, the better it is for getting to the truth. This time we'll look at appeal to the stone.
This is when you dismiss an idea or statement as absurd, invalid or incorrect without giving a satisfactory reason as to why.
Many armchair skeptics can be guilty of this fallacy as it is all too easy to reject an idea without really understanding the topic. But then again, those who believe in talking to the dead, for example, can be too quick to write off more mundane explanations.
Of course I don't believe in little green men coming here in flying saucers. I don't know much about space travel, but the whole idea is just ridiculous.
So far, there is no good evidence to suggest aliens or robotic ships have visited the Earth from other planets. However, it would be naive to write the whole idea off as being ridiculous without some understanding of the topic. As Carl Sagan said, "For all I know, we may be visited by a different extraterrestrial civilization every second Tuesday, but there's no support for this appealing idea."
I hear that thousands of scientists have signed a paper calling for action on climate change. But I don't care. Climate change is just made up and silly.
Not understanding a topic like climate change and calling it silly is a very poor way of reasoning. We owe it to ourselves to do at least some research on a topic before taking a strong stand one way or the other.
The Earth is flat, I tell you. I mean, just look at the horizon. It's flat. The idea that the Earth is round is absurd.
It's funny to think that once upon a time, thousands of years ago, people thought the same thing. We can forgive those ancient people as they didn't know better. But for the last 2,000 years, it has been widely accepted and understood that we live on a globe, no matter how absurd some people think that is. Even if you think an idea or claim is just too silly for you to entertain, it is worth the time to come to an understanding as to why you made that determination. Does the claim violate the laws of physics, for example? If so, which laws and why? What other reasons do you have to reject the claim? Then at least you'll have a better answer than simply calling it silly or ridiculous. This time, we'll look at the Fallacy Fallacy.
Also known as the bad reasons fallacy, This is when, because your opponent uses logical fallacies, you assume their main argument or point must therefore also be wrong.
Winning your argument due to the errors made by your opponent might be a little like winning the battle but losing the war. Not everyone is good at putting their case, even if their main point is true.
My friend was trying to convince me that NASA really did send astronauts to the moon in 1969, but her arguments really didn't stack up. Telling me it's true because everybody knows it's true is like a cop-out to me. No reason then for me to change my mind. I think it was all faked.
That NASA sent astronauts to the moon in the 60s and 70s is an historical fact. But it can be difficult to argue the case if you don't know the many, many details of the subject. It's very easy to get flustered and make bad arguments, even though, in the end, your main point is correct.
I had a choice between two treatments. One was considered natural, and the other was considered artificial. I went for the artificial treatment, as I know about the appeal to nature fallacy.
While much that is found in nature is toxic, that alone is no reason to reject a treatment. You need to look at the evidence behind any treatment, whether from nature or from a lab, to support your choices.
My friend who believes in evolution told me that it was all the scientists who also believe in evolution that finally convinced him. But as I listened to the Logical Fallacies segment on the Skeptic Zone podcast, I know that this is just the appeal to authority fallacy. He'll have to do better than that to convince me.
While it's great that this person is learning about logical fallacies, maybe they'll also come to understand that arguments and ideas can be quite involved and complex and need much more engagement than just pointing out logical fallacies along the way. In this case, the consensus of scientific opinion is being confused with an appeal to authority. While it might be easy to score points based on your opponent's poor arguments, try to bear in mind that, in the end, you are both hopefully trying to get to the truth. If something is true and real, it is true and real regardless of how well or how badly someone can argue the case for it. This time, we'll look at appeal to emotion.
Also known as argument from passion, this is when you manipulate emotions in order to try and win an argument, especially in the absence of good evidence. It is also a red herring. That is a way of diverting attention away from the key point.
Emotions colour our thinking. It's just part of life. We can keep them in check at times, but they do have a habit of getting the better of us. Strong emotions do not always mean a strong argument.
I didn't know what to think when I went to see that psychic, but soon she told me that my late mother was looking down on me and loved me. I was in tears. You cannot tell me it was fake. I know it was my mother.
This situation is not uncommon when people go to see a psychic, even one doing a stage routine in front of an audience. Any doubts may be suppressed as people experience the weight of their grief. For many people, thinking critically during an emotional reading is the last thing on their mind, and as skeptics, we should acknowledge this.
Did you see that TV commercial for homeopathic treatment for teething? The mother told of how much her son was suffering. I hope everything worked out okay.
The appeal to emotion has been used in advertising for years and years. Diet products can play on our emotional insecurity of body image, and political campaigns can play on our fears of what might happen if the other party wins an election. In our example, based on a real TV commercial shown in Australia, the story of a suffering baby pulls at our heartstrings, even though the product on sale does not work as claimed.
I was watching all these videos online of parents who told sad and frightening stories of what happened to their children after getting vaccinated. They really made me think whether I should risk taking my own baby in to get the jab.
Like so many unsupported beliefs or conspiracy theories, the anti-vaccination movement is full of sincere people who tell their stories. Skeptics should take into account the fact that people feel very strongly when their own children are involved and appreciate how the appeal to emotion can override common sense. Emotions have been used to sway us one way or the other ever since the first humans roamed the plains. At times they add a valid and necessary component to an argument, but watch out, as at other times they serve to only cloud the issue. This time, we'll look at Ipse Dixit.
Also known as "it simply is," this is when an opinion is given as if it were an undisputed fact, without any need for supporting evidence.
This fallacy occurs when someone just assumes something is true or real and therefore cannot see the need to offer any proof to back up their point.
I went to see the doctor about my sore neck, but a week later I'm still in pain. I should have known better. Doctors don't know what they're doing and are only paid shills for Big Pharma. Everyone knows that.
This unsupported point of view is all too common among certain alternative medicine devotees and conspiracy theorists alike. To them, it's true because it conforms with their worldview. The term "everyone knows" is a red flag that can indicate a poor argument.
It's true that the stars in the heavens can foretell the future and control our destiny. Why is it true? It's true because it just is true. I mean, it seems obvious to me, and people have known about this for thousands of years.
Saying something is true because it's true is a classic Ipse Dixit. In this case, the appeal to tradition is also used to seem to add weight to the non-argument.
I asked my medical professional why I should take the remedy she recommended. She told me it was because she recommends it. Okay then, I better take it.
As you can see in this example, no real reason is given as to why the remedy should be taken. Oh, and there's another red flag in there too. Watch out for the term medical professional. Sadly, these days that term can include homeopaths, naturopaths, and others using unproven modalities. Even if an argument seems to make sense or seems to be true, it needs more than an unsupported conclusion in order for it to be a valid case or point of view. This time, we'll look at the Slothful Induction fallacy.
This is when, even though there is enough good evidence to support a conclusion, this evidence is rejected and replaced by something possibly unrelated but more in line with a particular worldview.
It can be hard, even when faced with reality, to reject something you sincerely believe to be true. If the outcome is positive, then all the more reason to hold on to that belief.
The water diviner we hired was able to find water on our farm. Now, I know underground water is not uncommon, but I saw him in action, and I'm convinced of his abilities.
Yes, underground water in the farming regions of Australia and many other countries is not uncommon. Yet some people will still credit something like the mythical powers of a water diviner when water is found. Maybe they believe in it to begin with. Maybe they are impressed by the theatrics. Or maybe they happen to be unlucky when sinking a well in the past when not using a diviner.
I'm pleased to say that my cancer is in remission and the prognosis is looking good. Thank goodness I followed the natural healer's advice and stopped eating red-coloured food while undergoing chemotherapy.
Stories like this are well known to skeptics. Even though people, sometimes very reluctantly, will submit to chemotherapy and other science-based interventions, they will still credit any improvement to whatever unproven alternative treatment they are taking at the same time. We should not expect people who are in fear of their lives to always think rationally.
I saw a UFO last week. I'm sure it was an alien spaceship. It was very bright in the evening sky and seemed to hover for some time, even though my skeptical friend said it was in the same location in the sky as the planet Venus. It makes more sense to me that it was a real UFO.
Here we have a case of an object in the sky with two differing explanations. Venus is often mistaken for aircraft, even UFOs, and we know its location exactly at any given time. Yet, for some, it's far more exciting to conclude that aliens are the real cause of the strange light in the sky. The slothful induction fallacy is a way for people to preserve their beliefs, even though there is better evidence for them to reject those beliefs. It's far easier, hence the use of the word slothful, to just hold on to what you think is true. This time, we'll look at unfalsifiability.
Also known as untestability. This is when you make a claim that cannot be shown or proved to be incorrect or even correct via testing.
Skeptics have seen this fallacy many times and for many differing claims. Believers like to think that if skeptics or even science cannot disprove a claim, it therefore must be true.
I know that water divining always works out on the farm, but only if skeptics are kept away, as they have negative energy that interferes with divining.
Here we have a situation based on what some water diviners have said to skeptics over the years. The diviner in this case has made it impossible for a real investigation of his claims. Those claims, therefore, can never be shown to fail in a test. Even when diviners are tested, they will come up with what is to them a reasonable excuse to justify their failure. That excuse is never that divining itself does not work.
I tried to test a tarot card reader. She chose a card at random and told me a story about it and asked me if I could relate to it. When I said no, she turned the card upside down and told me the opposite of what she said before. Well, what do you know? Some of it fit me.
This example is based on a real conversation between a skeptic and tarot card reader. Here we see that no matter what was said in the reading, with a bit of post hoc rationalisation, it can be claimed that the tarot cards are never wrong.
I have a dragon living in my garage. It's invisible, so you cannot see it. It breathes fire, but the fire is also heatless, so you cannot detect it. The dragon floats in the air, so you cannot weigh it. But take my word for it, the dragon is real.
Here we have a classic example from Carl Sagan in his book, The Demon-Haunted World. No matter what test you come up with to find out if the dragon is real or not, there will always be some reason as to why the test is impossible. Therefore, you can never show the dragon is not there. Falsifiability is a cornerstone of the scientific method. Any claim put forward that cannot be, at least in theory, be shown to be incorrect is unscientific and deserves your skepticism. This time, we'll look at affirming the consequent.
This is when you assume or conclude a cause for a phenomenon is based on the phenomenon itself without taking other possibilities into account.
You can think of this fallacy along these lines. If X happens, then Y is the result. Since Y has happened, then the cause must be X. Maybe our example will make this a little more clear.
I went to see a natural healer, as my cold was not getting better. She told me she'd seen this sort of thing before when another one of her patients had side effects from prescription medication. So now I know to steer clear of that medication in the future.
A stubborn cold may be caused by many things, ranging from picking up a second cold even as you are recovering from the first, confusing the cold symptoms with that of an allergy, possible side effects from medication, or even the cold virus itself being more resistant than normal to your body's natural defences. In our example, there is no good reason to conclude that the prescription medication must be the cause.
My natural healer told me if I took the homeopathic remedy, my cold would get better. Well, my cold did get better. Therefore, the homeopathic remedy worked.
Another example for our man with a cold. This time, he beat the cold. But does that mean the homeopathic remedy really did work? We can say that almost certainly it did not. So therefore, there must be another reason the cold went away. But maybe we can see why he mistakenly credits homeopathy as he trusts what the natural healer tells him. We've covered the appeal to authority before.
It's well known that Sasquatch leaves giant footprints behind. On a recent expedition, I found some giant footprints. Therefore, I know Sasquatch is real.
As intriguing as the idea of Sasquatch or Bigfoot is, and despite many giant footprints being found over the years, the reality of such a creature is still in great doubt, and that is after decades of searching. It seems then that those plaster casts of giant footprints we've seen, mostly from the 1970s and 80s, could well have been produced by another and very clever bipedal animal who likes fooling people with pranks. Sometimes it just seems logical to conclude one thing leads to another. Sometimes it does, but sometimes the original cause of an event may be something else entirely. This time we'll look at red herring.
This is when someone gives you irrelevant information in an attempt to distract you from the topic at hand, often to avoid a question or shift the discussion in a new direction.
Red herrings are used to avoid talking about a subject, especially if you think you might lose an argument. They might seem to be related to the topic at hand, but can end up taking you far from where you wanted to be.
We skeptics tested a psychic who claimed to be able to talk to the dead. When it seemed apparent she could not do so, she complained that scientific testing was just another belief system and was not able to test what she does. The test was stopped and the rest of the time was spent trying to explain to her how the scientific method works.
This is an example of something that is well known to skeptical investigators. When someone claiming psychic powers seems to be failing in a test, they may well stop and go off on a tangent. In this case, the red herring was to engage the skeptics in a talk about how science works.
So, you think homeopathy doesn't work? What about all the Western medicine that is recalled every year?
Whatever the case is with science-based medicine, often called Western medicine by alternative medical proponents, it really has no bearing on the validity of homeopathy. But before you know it, you are talking about other things rather than homeopathy.
The astrologer said he could predict the outcome of the next election. When that didn't come to pass, he explained how hard he'd been working on a new form of astrology that took more stars into consideration.
Maybe this new astrology is very interesting and something to talk about. But whether that is the new astrology itself or the hard work put into it, neither has anything to do with the past failure to predict the election. Chasing a red herring means you have been taken away from the point in hand. Before you know it, the original topic has been lost and you might not be able to return to it. This time, we'll look at the perfect solution fallacy.
The perfect solution is an all-or-nothing way of thinking. Unless the outcome is 100% perfect, the baby may well end up being thrown out with the bathwater. In other words, the idea is being rejected altogether.
This can be a pitfall when making decisions, especially if the right thing to do doesn't particularly appeal to us, and we are looking for ways to justify our inaction to ourselves and others.
I'm not going to get vaccinated for COVID-19. The vaccination is only 95% effective and you need 2 doses. Look at all those healthcare workers who still caught it.
The 95% efficacy rate of some of the COVID-19 vaccines is actually very high. The fact that a person may fall into the 5% category and not achieve adequate protection is no reason to deem the vaccine not worth having. The healthcare workers who caught COVID-19 after their first inoculation had yet to receive their second dose, and it may also be possible that they were already infected. That small number of cases is also no reason to dismiss the vaccine outright. Also, protesting that a vaccine is not 100% effective is a classic argument of the anti-vaccination movement.
This mask is uncomfortable and not 100% effective in reducing the spread of COVID-19. I'm not going to bother wearing it.
Despite not being 100% effective, mask wearing is advised by medical specialists to inhibit the aerosol spray responsible for the spread of the virus. It isn't an all or nothing scenario. All reduction in transmission helps to keep the pandemic under control.
How am I going to find an hour a day to exercise? I'm just too busy and tired. There's no point in bothering for just 15 to 20 minutes.
The recommended amount of exercise is approximately 1 hour per day. However, when that isn't possible, it's easy to convince ourselves not to make an effort and give up on exercising. While we may not be able to achieve the maximum benefits, exercising for a shorter time will still be of benefit to our health, especially in contrast to the scenario of doing no exercise at all. While we often want to make excuses to ourselves to avoid doing something we don't like, or if we want to bolster an argument that really doesn't have the weight of evidence on our side, it can be tempting to succumb to wanting a solution or situation to be perfect in every way. However, in reality, we should weigh up the pros and cons and make better judgments that are not so simple and dismissive. This time, we'll look at the fallacy of composition.
This fallacy is about transferring or projecting the properties shared by a set of individual components to the whole group or product as if they were one and the same.
The fallacy of composition can appear to be quite similar to the fallacy of hasty generalisation. However, the latter usually means extrapolating from only a small or anomalous sample to a larger one and drawing the wrong conclusion based on insufficient evidence. It's also the opposite of the fallacy of division, which assumes that what is true for the whole is also true for some or all of its parts.
I don't believe humans have caused global warming. Those so-called climate scientists commit the composition fallacy in their research. They aggregate temperature anomalies from specific regions, then apply that to the whole planet to say that it's warming. You have to look at each individual region separately.
If climate change scientists simply aggregated regional temperature anomalies and called it global warming, it might be arguable that they are committing the composition fallacy. However, it is valid to extrapolate in this way in some cases and not in others. The difficulty lies in knowing which side is correct in any given scenario. In this case, aside from charting averages and highlighting general trends, additional supporting evidence for the theory of global warming comes into play, and temperature data is consistent with the data from multiple lines of inquiry, including the warming oceans, melting ice sheets, and retreating glaciers, just to name a few.
One of the reasons I believe that a higher power exists is because, like many other people, I feel a sense of purpose for being here. This must also mean that human beings are placed here on Earth for a purpose.
This is a fallacy that we sometimes see coming from theists. It's true that people often feel a sense of purpose or have pet causes. However, just because any number of individuals may feel a sense of purpose, this notion cannot be transferred to humanity as a whole to argue that we have some kind of collective purpose for being here.
I've been doing some research online and have decided to give up eating foods that have names I can't pronounce, and I'm also going to avoid chemicals. First to go is salt. Did you know it contains chlorine? That's toxic to humans.
It's certainly true that sodium and chlorine are harmful to humans at certain levels when ingested separately. However, the chemical reaction that occurs when they are combined creates table salt, which is not toxic and something we eat every day. Simply considering the properties of individual chemical components does not mean that identical properties apply to the whole product.
Western medical practitioners are so reductionist. I'm going to see a naturopath who will treat me as a whole person, not just focus on my liver disease. Organs in the body don't function in isolation. They are part of a system that includes the mind, body, and spirit.
Diseases do not necessarily occur in isolation, and the majority of doctors are going to look at lifestyle and other factors that may contribute to an illness or chronic condition. However, practitioners of Western medicine do not transfer the properties of a disease in a specific organ to the body as a whole, as if they were essentially the same thing, as in the case of the systems approach of the holistic health practitioners. The fallacy of composition occurs when we believe that what is true for individual parts is true for the whole. Think of it this way. Sometimes what is good for the individual is good for the group, but at other times it is not. Therefore, we have to be careful about determining when this is fallacious thinking or when it is true, and may need to seek other kinds of evidence to support our position. This time, we'll look at the appeal to common sense.
The appeal to common sense is a specific version of the alleged certainty. It occurs when somebody simply asserts their conclusion as an obvious fact. However, it may not necessarily be so.
When a person appeals to our common sense, they are making the assumption that it's knowledge we all share and can be taken for granted as correct due to our perceived universal human experience. However, there are times when we can be caught out, and what is really happening is that we are relying on intuition, folklore, or beliefs for which we have never truly examined the evidence.
I heard someone say they are not going to wait for a vaccine that might take years to develop. They're going to drink whiskey and might even investigate injecting a type of disinfectant if they think they may have come into contact with a person who has COVID-19. It's just common sense. You don't need to be a medical expert to know that alcohol kills viruses.
It's true that alcohol will kill viruses, and therefore it is safe to assume that using wipes or sprays with sufficient quantities of alcohol are going to be effective in killing pathogens in our homes. This is common knowledge, and correct hygiene practices have become common sense to a great extent. However, it does not follow that once ingested that the same will occur with disinfectants inside our bodies. Not only will it be ineffective, there is a risk of poisoning or even death depending on the substance.
If you really think about it, it kind of makes sense that some people think the Earth is flat and think that people on the bottom of the globe would simply fall off if it was a sphere. Have you ever tipped something upside down and seen what happens?
All of us have witnessed what happens when we tip something out and it appears to fall in a downwards direction. Most of us are also aware of the story of Isaac Newton and the apple falling from the tree and know that it's due to gravity. However, whilst we may think it is common sense that things fall downwards, gravity actually pulls us towards the centre of the globe, making it appear that the ground is at the bottom and the sky is at the top, wherever we may be standing.
My teacher friend asked her students to take a quiz to see what their preferred learning styles are. As they say in education, students learn best when teaching styles are matched to their learning styles.
It's highly intuitive to believe that students learn best when the way information is presented to them is in a form that suits the way they prefer to learn. For example, this assumes that the student who favours a visual style of learning will then perform best when information is presented in a visual format, such as pictures, graphs, video, etc. Apparently, 97% of educators believe this to be true, and it appears to be plain common sense. However, under scientific conditions, this has not proved to be correct. Research shows that around 70% of students do not choose to learn according to their preferences, but choose multiple styles of learning instead. Furthermore, they perform no better when given information in a way that matches their preferred learning styles than when that information is presented in another style. It has proven to be important that the focus should be on the quality and suitability of the delivery of the information, not on the learning style of the student. According to Voltaire, common sense is not so common. Although this is a slur, it is really quite a subjective form of knowledge. It can very much depend on our geography, culture, historicity, personal experiences, etc. As it is not derived from objective facts, as skeptics, it is important to keep this in mind and always seek the evidence rather than succumb to intellectual laziness and take common sense for granted, as it is not necessarily reliable and can't necessarily be asserted as factual. This time, we'll look at the fallacy of the single cause.
Also known as the causal oversimplification, this fallacy occurs when it is assumed that there is a single, simple cause of an outcome, when in fact there may be a number of causes.
Reducing the causes of a complicated issue to a single factor may be satisfying in our desire to keep things simple, and sometimes it is helpful to identify the most significant reasons as to why something has happened. However, we also need to keep in mind that there are many complicated situations where multiple factors have to be considered, and the situation is not entirely reducible to just one.
I just watched this amazing documentary by a celebrity chef who said that white flour and white rice are causing Westerners to become obese. It's called the no pale diet. Not just because of the colour, but because they put the pale in paleo. All I need do is permanently cut them out of my diet and I'll be trim.
Aside from the appeal to tradition and naturalistic fallacies coming into play when we try and base our diet on what our ancestors supposedly ate, this focus on white grains or even just food as the single cause of obesity is an oversimplification of what the multiple causes really are. We need to consider many factors such as overall caloric intake, genetics, mental health, education, resources, physical activity, and so on.
The president as a secret saviour doing God's work? Children being trafficked by Democrats and celebrities in underground tunnels? There's no explanation for believing this QAnon nonsense other than that conspiracy theorists must be plain gullible.
It's hard to understand how anyone could believe in this kind of conspiracy theory. However, believers are not initially presented with the information in a way that is obviously ludicrous. Gullibility may be one factor, but the beliefs happen gradually, based on grains of truth, and occur when there is vulnerability and feelings of powerlessness, mistrust, disinformation, political bias, sense of community, and a range of other factors.
Today I talked to my friend about her neighbour who refuses to vaccinate her children. We're going to gather some facts, and once she has the right information, I'm sure she'll change her mind.
If only human beings were so easily influenced by the facts. However, we are all primarily motivated by our emotions and biases, no matter how rational we think we are. It's a mistake to assume that the anti-vaccination crowd are simply watching YouTube and busy obtaining false information about vaccines online. Their information is also coming from some alternative health practitioners, television, the local health food store, trusted peers, family members, and even maverick doctors and researchers. Members of the anti-vaccination movement have all been exposed to the facts, yet the beliefs persist for various other reasons that include fear, government or pharmaceutical company mistrust, disinformation campaigns, grief, vaccine court payouts, religious beliefs, conspiracy theories, and the list goes on. As critical thinkers, we know it can be necessary to cut through the fluff by applying Occam's razor and recognise that the simplest explanation is often the right one. However, our reasoning may be faulty if we take an overly reductionist approach and attribute single causes to complicated situations. This time we'll look at argument from gibberish.
This occurs when a person makes a claim that something is true, then supports that claim with an explanation that includes highly technical jargon from a field that is difficult to comprehend. It also occurs when a claim is based on pure gibberish in lieu of a strong argument.
Both of these types of arguments are deliberately obtuse and designed to shut down or confuse the person questioning the claim. It relies on a person's lack of familiarity with the jargon or their scientific illiteracy and commonly appears in the pseudosciences that make reference to such notions as energy fields.
My neighbour was researching transcendental meditation and came across some information about how to achieve humankind's ascension into higher creational forms. He said the information could be difficult to follow for people not well versed in spiritual science, but the claims were all backed by solid arguments.
Rather than providing solid arguments, it is more common to see gibberish being used to create such arguments to back up the claim. For example, you may see something like a claim that sentient beings can collectively raise the level of the matrix of their creation through the synchronized raising of their vibrational energy. The role of the Earth matrix integrates the individual realities into that of space-time fields, and awareness systematically flows back from the cosmos to the consciousness of the human mind, achieving higher states of evolution. This kind of word salad is intended to sound as though it was actually based in science and is deliberately phrased in a way to intimidate. It uses big words and relies on scientific illiteracy in order to sound convincing. It is hoped that the reader or listener will simply defer and accept the argument in an "I'll take your word for that" kind of way.
I saw this ad on my social media newsfeed today. It claims that the Biocharger Revitalizer is a simple and inexpensive device designed as an integrated energy system that subtly stimulates and energizes the body's own energy in a safe and therapeutic way. It has the potential to cure fatigue, generate vitality, and enhance athletic performance, depending on the potential of the individual user. The device produces digitally pulsed electromagnetic fields, PEMP, through a range of frequencies that the cell can vibrate and resonate with in a customized way.
Such claims often go into technical detail in the hope that the jargon and references to actual physics and biology will be taken for granted as accurate. So-called energy medicine relies on debunked ideas such as that the body can be charged by a biocompatible energy field. The belief is that the individual cells in the body selectively resonate with the vibrations and frequencies surrounding them. Unhealthy cells supposedly absorb more energy as the voltage they generate is lower than healthy cells capable of producing more of their own energy requirements. Apparently, all that is required is to provide a broad enough range of pulsed harmonics and a bandwidth of frequencies in which the cells can find their match. However, in the words of Skepdoc Harriet Hall, never mind that cells don't vibrate, don't resonate, and don't have frequencies. A tuning fork can vibrate and a radio station can have a frequency, but a pancreas can't.
I read a newspaper article that said when dismissing astrology, skeptics claim that there is no connection between the stars and the human mind. Yet, science tells us this is not so, and we can make connections between the two based on an understanding of electromagnetism.
Some astrologers draw on astrophysics and neuroscience when making claims that astrology is scientifically proven, and they concoct explanations that combine facts from both fields to produce a whole new false concept. For example, you may see an explanation that states the effect of multiple neurons firing together in an area of the brain generates a measurable magnetic field outside the head. These neuromagnetic signals generated by the brain are only around a billionth of the strength of the Earth's magnetic field. So it is no great leap to conclude that the Sun, Moon, and planets, all which create tidal effects in the Earth's magnetosphere and cause fluctuations in the geomagnetic surface of the Earth, must have an influence on the human brain. Not only is this a false claim that we can easily detect by the Weasel Words, no great leap to conclude, the astrologers are hoping to bamboozle their target audience with the scientific vocabulary and try to capitalise on the scientific illiteracy of their followers. You may have heard the expression, if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with BS. This is definitely applicable to all arguments from gibberish. Whenever we lack the scientific literacy to counter these types of arguments specifically, we can still be quite suspicious of slabs of texts plucked from scientific papers, etc., to create gibberish in support of dubious claims. We can look for Weasel Words and do some research that debunks the nonsense. We can also ask those making the claim to explain the science further and are likely to discover that their ability to do so can be extremely limited, throwing up a red flag. Knowing a logical fallacy when you hear one, and even knowing its name, is important when arguing your point of view. However, you may come across as arrogant and not get very far if you call it out by name to your opponent when you hear it being used. If your opponent calls you out for using one, it's time to stop and think about how you are making your case. Use your knowledge of logical fallacies wisely, and remember that even if your point of view is right and you know all the pitfalls in arguing your case, it doesn't always mean you'll win on the day. And as skeptics, we must also remember that we too can be wrong at times. I'm Michelle Bijkersma from the Vic Skeptics. Thanks for listening.